Last time we were learning about who is a kosher Kohen, who's not a kosher Kohen. If somebody comes along and he says he's a Kohen, do you believe him? Don't you believe him? In the time of the Bais Din, we said because the Kohen that ate Truma was able to work in the Bais Din or anything, so they were much more careful. Just because the guy said he was a Kohen, he wasn't a Kohen unless if he proved it. But today, some people say that, so lechatchila today you can be paid if a guy says he's a Kohen, you can trust him. There were individuals that used to redeem their kids by 10, 20 different Kohanim, just to make sure they got it right the first time, or the 10th time. So they weren't sure, but again, very unique individuals did it. I know there was a Yid in France. He was very, very super frum. He has relatives in LA. But anyway, super frum, passed away many years ago. But he would put on all his kids' tefillin every day to say Shema on them. Even though he had his own very, very Mohodet tefillin, but every day he put on, after davening, he would put on all his kids' tefillin, say Shema, just to make sure that the tefillin were 100% kosher. So, but according to most people, the minhag in the Olam is, if a guy says he's a Kohen, if you know who the person is, not a guy who walks off the street and says, I'm a Kohen, then the din is he cannot do Pidyon Haben with him. I mean, the makel today that you can give him an aliyah, but that's an aliyah, but to give a guy that to actually allow him to redeem the firstborn, you don't do it unless if you know the person's a Kohen. Now, ideally, it's supposed to, it says you should try to find a Kohen that's what's called miyuchas b'Yisrael, meaning that you know he's established, family Kohen. But today, again, the poskim write, we don't know who that is, and therefore we don't go. But a guy that says you don't know him, he just walks off the street again, and he says he's a Kohen, you don't believe him either. No, if he's not Shem Shabbos, we discussed the other day that b'diavad you could say it's good because he's what's called Tinik Shenishba. It's not that he's openly, publicly desecrating, but if you know the guy goes to cemeteries or is married to women that he's not allowed to marry, so then you have to redo the Pidyon Haben. Because he's doing mitzvahs, he's transgressing sins that apply exclusively to a Kohen, so he wouldn't be allowed. Okay, here's an interesting shot that happened here in LA. What happens if a guy is a Kohen who's established a Kohen for many, many years, and then he did many Pidyon Habens, and then you find out that he's not a Kohen? Or he admitted that he wasn't a Kohen. So then you have to, number one, everybody that had a Pidyon Haben by him needs to redo a Pidyon Haben, and halachically he has to give back all the money of all the people that he did a Pidyon Haben to, if he remembers who they are.
It'd be like Madoff.
Yeah, that's a different story. I told you there was a story once, not about a Kohen, but there was one, this is what they say, many years ago, there was a goy in Bnei Brak that everybody sold their chametz to for years. The whole city would sell it to this one goy for many, many years. And then they found out the guy was a Jew. So the whole sale of chametz to him wasn't good because he was a Jew.
It didn't do out of Kabul.
It probably didn't do out of Kabul. Okay, next thing over here about a Pidyon Haben. Whose obligation is it to do a Pidyon Haben? There's a lot of interesting halachos with this. Okay, so the father has an obligation to do Pidyon Haben on the son. That's his obligation. So what happens though when the kid becomes bar mitzvah? Whose obligation is it now? Is it still the father's? Or is it now turned over to the son? So many opinion halachos hold that even after the kid becomes bar mitzvah, it's still an obligation on the father. Even though now the kid is, but the obligation, lechatchila, is on the father. Some people say, and that's more or less what's accepted today, that after the kid becomes bar mitzvah, then it's not the obligation anymore of the father. The father should have done it, he didn't. Now the obligation is on the kid himself. What happens if the father comes along and says, I don't want to redeem my son? Just doesn't want to do it. So in the time of a Bais Din, they would force the father to do it. That's one opinion. But another opinion is you don't force the father. He doesn't want to do it. It's like he doesn't want to put on tefillin. You don't force him to put on tefillin. The same thing as a positive mitzvah. But the poskim right nowadays we do not force a father who doesn't want to redeem his kid. You don't force him. You try to encourage him, but you don't actually force him to be paid the son. Now the mother doesn't have an obligation to redeem the son. But what happens if she wants to? Let's say the father's not doing it, or there is no father. So if she wants to do it, l'chatchila, the mother shouldn't do it, but it says she's allowed to do it, but she can even make a bracha. But again, the custom is she doesn't do it.
What do you mean?
But
She's a kohen?
no. If a woman is, let's say a woman has a firstborn baby, yeah? The husband is not doing it. Is she allowed to do the Pidyon Haben? So she doesn't have an obligation to do it. But the poskim don't say she's not allowed to do it. She says there's no obligation on her to do it. So some people want to derive from that expression in the poskim that she's not obligated to, but she could if she wants. It's similar to lulav, esrig, sukkah, those positive mitzvahs that women are not obligated in. But if they want, they could do it. So like by this, the Rambam holds, it's interesting, but by all the other mitzvahs we learned many times, the Rambam holds they're not supposed to do it. And if they do it, they cannot, definitely not make a bracha. But Pidyon Haben is not really a mitzvah such as a man grommet to such an extent, so even then they could do it. With a bracha. Now, what happens if a kid is an orphan? Years ago, that was very common. Father died before the kid had a Pidyon Haben, or he died even before the kid was born. So the din is the kid has to redeem himself when he becomes a bar mitzvah. And here he says, Ramah writes that a Bais Din doesn't redeem the kid before. There's two opinions. That before the kid grows up, before he becomes an adult, Bais Din doesn't do it. Some people say it's better that the Bais Din does do it. And today I believe the minhag is that if the kid's there's no father involved, for whatever reason, the Bais Din will be paid to the kid. Some people say that what happens if it's like an orphan, he doesn't have a father to redeem him, so the grandfather should do it, either the father's father or the mother's father. And some people say no, that they can't, because it's not their obligation. The grandchildren are not children. It's obligation on the father to the kid. So it'd be better then the kid does it himself when he gets older, or Bais Din does it, or whatever. Okay. What they do is they do Pidyon Haben, the kid does it again when he's an adult without a bracha. Okay. Now what happens, again, the father is out of the country. Again, in those days didn't have any calls and texts and emails. Father was out of the country. He didn't even know that he had a firstborn. They used to travel for 6 months, whatever, he'd be out of the country. In fact, from the Gemara comes out that men had different wives because then they were allowed to have many wives. So they would have different wives in different countries. And therefore there was a whole, the Gemara in Yavamis and all over the place. The guy dies, and all of a sudden there's a bunch of wives with a bunch of kids coming and say, hey, they're this guy's kids. They inherit or whatever it is. A whole long discussion in the Gemara. Do you believe? When do you believe? How do you believe? So what happens if father's out of the country and he doesn't even know that the firstborn was born? So some people say the grandfathers do it, but they do it on a condition. What's the condition? That when if the father finds out about it and wants to do the mitzvah himself, then he'll come back and do it. There's a very interesting discussion in halacha. It's a Gemara, but that's brought down Shulchan Aruch also. That what happens if I steal a mitzvah from you? You are about to do a mitzvah, and I come and steal the mitzvah from you. So Ram Gamliel, the time of the Gemara, made the guy pay a litra de dahava, which is a lot of money in gold. He made him pay for stealing the right of somebody to do a mitzvah, and you're taking away his right to do the mitzvah. Rabbi Gamliel would make him pay litra de dahava. I don't think it's a liter of gold, but it's a measurement, it's a decent measurement of gold he would make him pay. Because you're stealing, you're not allowed to steal somebody's mitzvah. Okay, now what happens if a kid was born out of wedlock? And so if the father says he's the father, then he's obligated to do it, but he shouldn't make shechion. Why? Because it's not a simcha and such an action that he did out of wedlock. But if he doesn't agree, he says, I'm not the father of the baby. They didn't have DNA in those days. He says, I'm not the father of the baby, then Bais Din has to redeem him, or he redeems himself when he becomes bar mitzvah. Okay, then, what happens if a kid is adopted? You know his biological mother is Jewish, okay? But the adopted father doesn't have to redeem him because it's not his kid. It's not his biological kid. He doesn't have a mitzvah of doing a pidyon of it. Okay, Machat Shina Zor Ma'aseh Ma'amach Beibel Ma'in Kim Shvlag Al Teira Ganan Mekashim Edot